The patient was dying. Every doctor in the room knew it, and every doctor in the room was wrong about why. 63 seconds. That's how long it took for Rachel Doan to see what 3 board-certified surgeons missed. A severed subclavian, hidden beneath the entry wound, bleeding slow and silent into the chest cavity while the monitors screamed and the lead surgeon called for a chest crack that would have finished the job. She was the nurse everyone ignored, the one they handed the clipboard to, the one who refreshed IV bags while the real doctors made the real decisions. She stepped forward anyway. She saved his life. They suspended her before the blood dried on her gloves. If this story has you gripping your seat already, you're exactly where I want you. Stay until the end. Like this video, follow along, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way most mornings started at Callaway Regional Medical Center. Understaffed, overcaffeinated, and running about 40 minutes behind on everything that mattered. Rachel Doan arrived at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift, which was also 13 minutes before anyone expected to see her. She came in early because early meant quiet, and quiet meant she could check the supply carts without someone standing over her shoulder explaining how to stack gauze. She knew how to stack gauze. She'd been stacking it, among other things, for 6 years at Callaway Regional, tucked into the low-traffic wing of a mid-size hospital in Delhart, Colorado, a city that sat between the mountains and the plains and couldn't quite decide which one it wanted to be. She hung her coat in the locker room, pulled her dark hair back, and walked the floor the way she always did, quiet, deliberate, cataloging everything without making it look like she was cataloging anything. The charge nurse, Denise Farrow, was already at the station when Rachel passed. Denise had a talent for looking busy while doing very little, and a sharper talent for making other people feel like they were doing very little while actually doing everything. She glanced up from her tablet, glanced back down, and said, "Supply audits on your list today." "Already started," Rachel said. Denise didn't respond to that. The ER floor at Callaway Regional moved in rhythms Rachel had learned to read the way other people read weather. The 7 a.m. shift change brought a brief, chaotic overlap where the night crew's unfinished business collided with the day crew's impatience. By 8, things settled into a low hum. By 10, the walk-ins started arriving. The sprained ankles, the chest colds, the people who'd waited 3 days to come in and now insisted their situation was urgent. Rachel moved through all of it without friction. She was good at that. Not invisible exactly. People saw her, gave her instructions, corrected her occasionally on things she already knew, and then moved on. She had a face that people filed away as familiar without ever quite attaching a name to it. Average height, medium build, the kind of stillness that read as unimpressive until you watched her hands during a procedure, at which point you either noticed something off about the way she moved, too practiced, too precise, too economical, or you didn't notice at all, which was the more common outcome. Dr. Silas Merritt arrived at 9:15 and immediately made his presence known. He was the attending trauma surgeon on rotation, 47, big-framed, with a jaw that suggested he'd played college football and a manner that suggested he still thought he did. He'd been at Callaway Regional for 11 years and treated that tenure like a territorial claim. Doan. He said her name the way someone might say the name of a piece of furniture they kept stepping around. Pre-op for the hip replacement in Bay 3 needs to be redone. Someone mislabeled the blood draw. "I can check the label," Rachel said. "I didn't say check it. I said redo it." She redid it. The original label was, in fact, correct. She said nothing about that. By 10:30, the floor was running at routine capacity. Rachel was restocking a crash cart in Bay 6 when the radio call came through. Trauma incoming, male, early 50s, injuries from a vehicle accident on Route 9. ETA 4 minutes. The voice on the radio relayed vitals that were unstable but holding. The ER charge shifted. That particular atmospheric change that happens in every hospital when the gears switch from maintenance to emergency. Nurses moving faster, residents straightening up, the low hum replaced by a sharper current. Rachel pushed the crash cart back into position and walked toward the trauma bay. "Don't!" Merritt again. He was pulling gloves on and didn't look up. "You're not on trauma today." "I can assist." "I said you're not on trauma today. Go back to the floor." She stood there, one beat. 2. Then she turned around and walked back toward Bay 6 and stood just outside the trauma bay's sightline, where she could hear the radio updates and the preparations, and she waited. The patient arrived at 10:44. His name, she would learn later, was Navy Commander Marcus Holt, though at 10:44 he was just a body on a gurney, gray-faced and wet, with a trauma team descending on him the way trauma teams do, controlled chaos organized around one objective: stop the bleeding, keep the heart moving. Merritt led. He was good. Rachel could say that honestly, even about him. He moved with authority and his calls were clean and quick. The entry wound from the steering column impact was on the right lateral chest, and he assessed it fast and called for a chest tube on the right side. Rachel took a step closer to the bay entrance. Just one step. Enough to see the monitors. The blood pressure was dropping in a pattern she recognized, not the pattern Merritt was treating. She watched the pulse ox, watched the pressure curve on the monitor. The chest tube went in on the right side, and the output was minimal, not absent, which was the detail that mattered. A right-side hemothorax would have given them more. What she was seeing in the pressure curve, the specific rate of decline, the subtle asymmetry in the secondary monitor readout, it was coming from somewhere else. Left subclavian, or close to it. Upper chest, left side. The impact had been on the right, which was exactly why nobody was looking at the left. "Dr. Merritt," she said. He didn't turn around. "Dr. Merritt, the pressure curve, Doan, I told you to get off this floor." Still not turning. "Farrow, get her out of here." Denise Farrow moved toward her. Rachel didn't move. "His pressure curve is wrong for a right-side bleed." She kept her voice level, flat, almost. "The rate of decline is too slow and too steady. It's coming from the left, upper thoracic, probably subclavian." The imaging shows the right side. The imaging was taken in the field. He's been in transit for 11 minutes. She looked past Farrow at the monitor. "If you open the chest right now, you'll decompress the wrong side and he'll arrest before you find the real source." Merritt turned around. He looked at her the way people look at something they can't quite categorize. Not quite anger yet, more like the expression right before anger, when the brain is still deciding whether the interruption is worth addressing. "Are you telling me how to run my trauma bay?" "I'm telling you where he's bleeding from." The monitor chose that moment to escalate. The blood pressure dropped another notch, sharper this time, the gentle slope breaking into something steeper. The resident closest to the screen said quietly, "He's dropping faster." Merritt looked at the monitor, then at Rachel, then at the monitor again. Something shifted in his face, not acknowledgement, not gratitude, something less defined than either of those. He looked at the imaging again. He looked at the secondary readout. Rachel watched him process it, watched the moment it landed, watched him recalibrate without being willing to say that's what he was doing. "Left upper chest," he said to the team. "Reassess." They found it 90 seconds later. Left subclavian, partially occluded by a bone fragment from the clavicle, which was why the external bleeding was minimal, why nothing had presented obviously on the initial assessment. It was a kill shot hiding behind a decoy wound. They repaired it. Commander Marcus Holt's blood pressure stabilized at 1109. Rachel was already back in Bay 6, restocking the crash cart. She thought that was going to be the end of it. She thought maybe Merritt would give her a curt nod in passing, or Farrow would say something like, "Good catch," and everyone would move on. That was the way it usually worked. You did something useful, you didn't make a scene about it, and life continued. She was wrong. At 1:15 p.m., Dr. Merritt appeared at the nursing station with the hospital's administrative director, Gregory Paul. Paul was a man who had worked his way up through hospital administration by being relentlessly agreeable to people above him and precise in his paperwork. He wore his suits like armor and had never in Rachel's observation shown anything resembling discomfort until now, when he appeared to be wearing his discomfort as a second layer over the suit. "Rachel Doan?" he said, though he clearly knew exactly who she was. "Yes." "Can you step into my office?" She looked at Merritt. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a point approximately 6 inches to her left, which told her everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. Paul's office was on the second floor, overlooking the parking structure. He closed the door, gestured to a chair, and sat down across from her with a manila folder on the desk between them. that she was fairly certain was mostly for atmosphere. He said, "There's been a formal complaint filed regarding your conduct in the trauma bay this morning." Rachel sat with that for a moment. "I intervened in a patient care decision. You contradicted a senior physician during an active trauma resuscitation. The patient would have arrested." Paul opened the folder. It did not appear to contain anything particularly relevant to the current conversation. "Doctor, Merritt has indicated that your intervention was disruptive and potentially dangerous, and that any adjustments to the treatment plan were based on his own reassessment, not on anything you suggested." Rachel looked at him. She didn't say anything. "Furthermore," Paul continued, "your conduct this morning represents a pattern of behavior that administration has been monitoring. There have been previous incidents documented." "What incidents?" "Questioning physician assessments, overstepping the scope of your role, comments made to residents during procedures that were considered undermining." Rachel thought about the hip replacement blood draw that morning. She thought about the half-dozen times in the past year she'd flagged something and been told to write it up, and had written it up, and the write-ups had apparently gone somewhere other than where they were supposed to go. She thought about the particular quality of the silence in that trauma bay while Merritt retooled his approach without once looking at her. "I'm being suspended," she said. Paul shifted in his chair. "Effective immediately. We'll need your badge." She took the badge off and set it on the desk. She didn't slam it. She didn't need to. She set it down with the specific precision of someone who knows that the most devastating thing she can do right now is be completely, utterly composed. "How long?" she said. "That's pending review." She stood up. "Is there anything else?" He hesitated. "I want you to understand this is not—" "I understand perfectly," Rachel said. "Thank you for your time." She walked down the second-floor hallway and down the stairs and back through the ER floor to the locker room. She was aware of eyes tracking her. The nurses at the station, a resident who paused mid-chart, the orderly near Bay 2. She looked straight ahead. She collected her coat, her bag, the small container of almonds she kept on the top shelf because hospital vending machines were catastrophic. She walked out through the ambulance bay instead of the main entrance because the ambulance bay was less traveled, and she wanted 60 additional seconds of not being watched. Outside, the Colorado afternoon was overcast, the mountains invisible behind a flat gray lid of cloud. She stood in the ambulance bay for a moment and breathed, and felt the adrenaline that she'd been sitting on for the last 3 hours finally move through her like cold water. Then she walked to her car and drove home. Her apartment was on the third floor of a building on Carver Street. 2 bedrooms she used as 1 bedroom and 1 room full of things she told herself she'd eventually organize. She'd been telling herself that for 4 years. The apartment was clean in the way that spaces are clean when the person living in them has learned to occupy very little of the available territory. She put her coat on the hook by the door, put her bag on the kitchen counter, and stood in the center of the living room for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular. She'd been dismissed from worse things than a hospital job. The thought was cold and factual and not particularly comforting, but it was true. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started writing down everything she remembered from the trauma bay. Not because she was planning to do anything with it yet. She wasn't sure what yet looked like, but because the specific details mattered, and details degraded fast, and she had learned a long time ago in a context that had nothing to do with Callaway Regional Medical Center, that the discipline of recording was the discipline of not losing ground. She wrote for 40 minutes. Then she closed the notebook, drank her coffee, and thought about the secondary monitor readout, the one that had shown her the pressure curve pattern that Merritt had initially read wrong. She thought about the bone fragment, the way the subclavian had been partially occluded, just enough to slow the bleed, just enough to look like a secondary injury instead of the primary one. She'd seen that presentation twice before, not in a civilian hospital. She didn't let herself follow that thought any further. The call came at 7:22 that evening. Unknown number, Colorado area code. She picked it up because she'd learned that not picking things up didn't make them stop coming. "Miss Doan?" A man's voice, measured, careful with its own control. "My name is Marcus Holt. I'm told you were in the room this morning." She was quiet for a moment. "You're awake." "I'm medicated." A pause. "And I'm told that if Dr. Merritt had done what he was planning to do when I came through those doors, I wouldn't be awake." Or anything else. You should rest. I will. I wanted to make a call first. Another pause. Longer this time, and she got the sense he was choosing something. Who are you? I'm a nurse. That's a job title. It's the answer to your question. She heard him exhale slowly. Okay, that's fair. Then, they suspended you. She didn't ask how he knew. He was a Navy commander in a hospital. Hospitals were not airtight, and a man with his background and rank would have ways of getting information that a nurse on administrative leave did not. Yes, she said. For saving my life. For disrupting the trauma bay. He was quiet for a moment. Then, do you plan to challenge it? I plan to look at my options. That's not the same thing as yes. No, she agreed. It's not. She heard movement on his end, the particular rustling of a person shifting position in a hospital bed, trying to find a configuration that didn't hurt. I'm going to ask around, he said, about you. There's not much to find. He said it in a way that suggested he'd already found something worth noting in the brevity of her answer. Get some sleep, Ms. Doan. You too, Commander. She hung up, sat still for a moment, then got up and checked the locks on her door and her windows, which was something she did every evening as a matter of established habit that she had long since stopped examining for its origins. 3 days passed. She did not go back to the hospital. She went to the grocery store, went for runs along the river trail, cooked things she hadn't had time to cook while working doubles. She called her sister in Albuquerque and talked about nothing for 45 minutes, which was how long it took her sister to get the kids to bed. She did not tell her sister about the suspension. She would eventually. Not yet. On the second day, she received an email from the hospital's HR department with a subject line that said, "Administrative leave, next steps," and contained a 3-page document outlining the formal review process, which could take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks and would include a panel of department heads that included, among others, Dr. Silas Merritt. She read it once, printed it, put it in a folder. On the third evening, there was a knock at her door at 8:47 p.m. She did not have many visitors. The few people she had in her life in Delhart knew to call first. She stood in the hallway of her apartment and looked at the door and felt the specific quality of stillness that comes not from calm, but from trained response. Assessment before action, always. "Who is it?" she said. A beat. Then, "My name is Agent Teresa Voss. I'm with the FBI. I'd like to talk with you about your employment history, Ms. Doan." Rachel's hand was on the doorframe. She looked at the closed door, and behind her expression, something shifted. A recalibration the way a compass needle moves when you bring a magnet close. Not dramatically, just finding a new, true north. She opened the door. The woman outside was in her 40s, compact, dark suit, the kind of ID badge that looks more official the longer you look at it. Behind her, further back in the hallway, a second agent, younger, male, staying outside the door's side angle the way field-trained people do. "Ms. Doan." Voss held up the badge. "May we come in?" Rachel looked at the badge, then at Voss, then past Voss at the angle of the second agent's positioning, which told her something about how they'd been briefed and what kind of entry protocol they were following, neither of which matched a routine employment check. She stepped back from the door. "Your employment history," Rachel said, not asking, just repeating it back the way you do when you want someone to know you heard exactly what they said. "Among other things." Voss came inside, and the second agent followed and closed the door behind him and stayed near it. Professional, practiced. "We understand you were suspended from Callaway Regional 3 days ago. That's not confidential information." "No." Voss looked around the apartment with the calibrated non-curiosity of someone trained to absorb everything without appearing to. "It's not. But we're less interested in the suspension than in what it set in motion." "What did it set in motion?" Voss looked at her directly. "Are you familiar with a man named Douglas Farron?" Rachel's face was still. "No." "He was a hospital administrator at a facility in Keeler, Wyoming, 12 years ago. He was also a retired military contractor with access to personnel records from certain classified units." She paused. "Someone accessed your file, Ms. Doan. Not your nursing file. Your other file. The one that takes a specific security clearance to even know exists. The room felt very quiet. That access happened 4 hours after you saved Commander Holt's life, Voss said. Rachel sat down in the kitchen chair she'd been sitting in 3 days ago, with the cold coffee and the notebook full of clinical observations. She sat with the same composure. But her hands, under the table, were very still in the specific way that hands are still when the person they belong to is running a very rapid internal calculation. "Who accessed it?" she said. "We don't know yet. That's why we're here." "You're here because someone pulled my classified file." She looked at Voss. "Or you're here because whatever's in that file is about to become a problem for someone, and you need to know how much I know." Voss held her gaze. "That's a perceptive reading of the situation." "I'm a nurse," Rachel said, flat as before. "We notice things." The second agent near the door hadn't moved. Voss was watching Rachel with the particular attention of someone recalibrating their read on a person they'd made preliminary assumptions about. "Ms. Doan," Voss said slowly. "How long has it been since you heard from anyone in your former unit?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Rachel looked at the wall, at the middle distance, at the specific point in space where a person looks when they're deciding how far back into a very dark room they're willing to let someone follow them. 7 years, she said. Voss nodded. Once. The kind of nod that means I expected that answer, and also this is worse than I thought. "We may need you to be reachable," Voss said. "Day or night." "I'm always reachable," Rachel said. "That's not the same thing as available." She watched Voss take that in. The distinction, the implication behind it. The very specific vocabulary of someone who had spent years operating in contexts where reachable and available were two different tactical categories. The agents left at 9:14 p.m. Rachel sat in the kitchen for a long time after the sound of their steps faded in the stairwell. She sat until the coffee she hadn't made yet became something she should make, and then didn't make that either. 7 years. She'd built 4 years of quiet in this city, a job that asked nothing of her except to not exceed her designated lane, an apartment she occupied like a temporary structure, a life calibrated to leave no signature. She thought about Commander Holt in his hospital bed, asking, "Who are you?" and the answer she'd given him that was true and also nowhere near sufficient. She thought about a classified file that someone had just pulled. She thought about a unit that had not existed, officially, in 7 years, and the specific reason it had stopped existing, and the specific man who had made that happen, and the specific way she had spent 7 years deciding whether she was ever going to do anything about it. She got up. She went to the closet in the second bedroom, the room full of things she'd been meaning to organize. She pushed past the hanging coats and the storage boxes and the deliberate, practiced mundanity of the life she'd built over the top of the one she'd buried. At the back of the closet, behind a cardboard box of miscellaneous cables, was a small fireproof safe. She hadn't opened it in 14 months. She opened it now. Inside, a phone she'd never connected to any carrier account. A folded document with a set of numbers that weren't phone numbers but served a similar purpose for people who knew the system. A photograph, face down, that she didn't turn over. And beneath those things, a military ID card with her photograph on it, her face younger by a decade, her expression unchanged, under a name that was not Rachel Doan. She picked up the card and held it. Somewhere in a hospital across the city, a Navy commander was asking questions about a nurse who'd saved his life. Somewhere in a federal office, an FBI agent was looking at a clearance-level file access log and trying to figure out who had just lit a fuse. And somewhere, she didn't know where, had spent 7 years not tracking where, the people responsible for what had been done to her unit were still operational, still covered, still sitting behind the wall of silence that one man had built with enough authority and enough ruthlessness to make it hold for the better part of a decade. Rachel set the ID card down on the shelf. She picked up the burn phone. She looked at the number sheet. She had 6 names on it. The last time she'd checked, 4 of them were still reachable. Maybe 3. Maybe fewer. She stood in the dark of the closet, the safe open at her feet, and made a decision that she'd been deferring for 7 years with the particular discipline of someone who knows that the decision, once made, cannot be unmade. That the moment she dialed the first number, the quiet she'd built in this city would be over, and whatever came after would be something she'd have to see through to the end or not at all. Her thumb moved to the keypad. She started to dial. She dialed the first number. It rang 4 times and went to a generic voicemail. No name, no greeting, just a beep. She didn't leave a message. She hung up and dialed the second number. It rang twice. Yeah. A man's voice, rough at the edges, the particular roughness of someone who'd been asleep or close to it. It's me, Rachel said. 3 seconds of silence. Then, how long ago? 4 hours? Maybe less. Same file or adjacent? Same. Full access. Whoever pulled it knew the exact designation. Another pause. Shorter this time, the sound of someone sitting up, something shifting. You still in Colorado? Yes. FBI make contact? She hesitated half a second, which told him what he needed to know before she answered. Tonight. That's fast. His voice had changed, still rough, but the loose edges were gone, replaced by something tighter. They give you a name? Farron? Kessler? Farron. A breath. Low, controlled. Farron's dead. He died 18 months ago. Whoever used his access credentials either stole them before he died or has been sitting on them long enough that nobody noticed. Rachel was quiet for a moment. That means it's been planned. Yeah. How long have you known about this? He didn't answer right away. When he did, the answer was flat and precise. Long enough that I should have called you first. I didn't because I was hoping it was going to stay buried. It didn't. No. A short silence. I'll make contact with the others. Give me 12 hours. I may not have 12 hours. Then give me what you have, she told him. Not everything. Not the photograph she hadn't turned over, not the ID card still sitting on the shelf behind her, but the essentials, the trauma bay, the suspension, Holt, the FBI agents, and the way Voss had positioned herself in the apartment, and the specific question she'd asked at the end, because the specific phrasing of a question told you more than the answer ever did. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Holt's a problem. He's a commander with questions. Commanders with questions have staff. Staff talk. If somebody's watching the file access and they see Holt making inquiries on top of the FBI access, it's going to look like a coordinated pull. It's going to look like we're moving. Maybe we should be. Silence again. Longer. Then, I'll call you back. His name was Danny Rice, and she hadn't spoken to him in 14 months, which was the longest gap since she'd left. Before that, they'd checked in sporadically, coded, brief, structured around the mutual understanding that contact was a calculated risk and frequency made it riskier. He'd been a combat medic in the same classified unit she had, a staff sergeant with a gift for field triage and a temper he'd spent 8 years learning to manage, not always successfully. He was 39 now, living somewhere in New Mexico under a name she knew but didn't use, doing work she'd never asked him to describe. She closed the safe, left the burn phone on the kitchen counter, went to bed at 11 p.m., not because she thought she'd sleep, but because lying horizontal was a choice, and choices had a kind of weight to them. They kept you anchored when the situation was trying to pull you loose. She slept for 4 hours. Dreamless, which wasn't nothing. In the morning, there was a certified letter from Callaway Regional's legal department. She read it at the kitchen table with the burn phone 3 inches to her left and the notebook with her clinical observations open to a fresh page. The letter was 6 paragraphs of careful language that amounted to, "Your suspension has been upgraded to a formal termination pending review, and any attempt to contact hospital staff, patients, or administrators during this period may be construed as interference." She read the word patients twice. They were already trying to seal off Commander Holt. She made coffee, real coffee this time, and drank half of it standing at the window watching the street below. The morning traffic, the woman walking a dog with a bad hip, the delivery truck double parked in front of the pharmacy 2 buildings down. Ordinary morning, the kind that looked the same whether everything was fine or everything was accelerating towards something irreversible. Her regular phone rang at 8:44. Unknown number, but Wyoming area code. Ms. Doan. A man's voice, different from Voss, different from Rice. This one had the particular cadence of someone accustomed to speaking on records. Formal, precise, with just enough warmth applied on top to seem conversational without actually being so. "My name is Garrett Lund. I'm calling on behalf of a group of investors who have a significant interest in Callaway Regional Medical Center." She said nothing. "We're aware of the circumstances of your termination," Lund continued, "and we'd like to discuss a potential resolution, a financial resolution." "I'm listening," she said, which was true, and did not constitute agreement to anything. "Our clients are prepared to offer a severance package substantially above standard in exchange for a signed confidentiality agreement covering your observations, interactions, and any communications during your tenure at the hospital." He paused. Including anything related to patients treated during your final shift." There it was. "What's the number?" she said. He told her. It was significant. It was also, she noted, considerably more significant than would be justified by a simple wrongful termination settlement for a floor nurse. "I'd need to have my attorney review it," she said. "Of course. We can have the documents to you by end of business today." "I'll be in touch," she said, and ended the call. She wrote down Garrett Lund's name, the Wyoming area code, the exact dollar figure he'd cited, and the phrase including anything related to patients treated during your final shift. Then she drew a line between that phrase and Commander Holt's name on the previous page. Someone wasn't just trying to bury her suspension. They were trying to buy her silence about Marcus Holt, which meant they knew who he was and what it meant that he was asking questions, and they were trying to move faster than those questions could travel. She picked up the burn phone. Rice called back before she could dial. "I've got 2 of them," he said. "Margot's dark. Hasn't responded in 8 months. I don't know if that's caution or something worse." Margot Seville, the unit's former intelligence analyst, former special operations support, former everything. Rachel had been careful not to think about the something worse possibility for 8 months, which was coincidentally how long it had been since she'd tried the contact herself. "And Decker?" "Decker's in. He's been watching the Hale network for 2 years. He says there's been movement, funding transfers, personnel realignments, a federal contract that got quietly renewed 6 months ago that shouldn't have been renewable." Colonel Owen Hale. She let the name sit in her mind without reaction, the way you let a bruise sit, present, acknowledged, not useful to press. "What kind of contract?" she said. "Defense logistics. Medical supply chain, technically. Decker says it's the same shell structure they used before, just new incorporation dates. They rebuilt it. They never stopped. They just went quieter after..." He paused. "After the unit dissolved. After the order they refused. After the 4 members who didn't survive the aftermath of refusing it. After." She stood at the kitchen window. The delivery truck was gone. The woman with the dog was gone. The street looked normal. "Somebody accessed my file the same day I saved a Navy commander's life," she said. "That's not coincidence." "Holt was part of something," Rice said. "Decker's trying to trace his connection to Hale's network. It might be direct, might be peripheral. Could be he was in the wrong accident for the wrong reasons. Or the right ones." "Yeah." She told him about Lund's call. The offer. The number. Rice was quiet for long enough that she could hear him thinking. Then, "They're scared. They should be. Rachel." His voice dropped half a register. Not softer, just more careful. "If we start pulling on this, we're not going to be able to control where it goes. Decker's one person. I'm one person. Without Margot, I know what we are without Margot. Then you know..." "I know," she said. "I'm going to make a call." She wasn't talking about Rice, and he understood that, and the silence that followed was the kind that held a question he chose not to ask. She said, "Give me today." "I'll give you today. Then we need to make a decision together." "Agreed." She hung up. Commander Marcus Holt was still at Callaway Regional. She knew this because she'd driven past it that morning on her run. Yes, her run happened to take her down Hartwell Avenue where the hospital sat. That was a coincidence she was comfortable with. And his name had appeared in the visitor registry she'd pulled up on her phone using a login she technically no longer had access to, which was a minor detail she filed away alongside several other minor details she'd been accumulating. She couldn't call him directly. The termination letter was specific about patient contact, and she didn't want to give the hospital's legal department any additional leverage before she understood the full shape of what she was dealing with. But she could call his JAG officer. It took her 22 minutes to find the right name, Lieutenant Commander Pris Okafor, currently assigned to the Navy's legal office out of the federal building in Denver, 3 hours south. She called the main line, identified herself as a civilian medical professional with information relevant to an active duty patient situation, and was told that Lieutenant Commander Okafor was in a meeting but would be given the message. Okafor called back in 40 minutes. Ms. Doan. Her voice was measured, professional, but there was a current under it that said she'd already been briefed on at least some of what had happened. I've been told you were the attending nurse when Commander Holt came in. I was. And that you were subsequently terminated. The day of, yes. A brief pause. That's unusual. I thought so too. What kind of information do you have for me? I received a call this morning from someone named Garrett Lund, representing investors with a financial interest in Callaway Regional. He offered me a settlement in exchange for a confidentiality agreement. She paused. The agreement specifically included a clause covering anything related to patients treated during my final shift. Silence on the other end. The kind that isn't empty. Can you document that call? Okafor said. I have the time, the area code, the name, and the specific language he used. I didn't record it. I didn't know it was coming. Any other contact from hospital administration or affiliated parties since your termination? I received a letter this morning upgrading my suspension to a formal termination. It also included language prohibiting contact with patients. That's a fairly aggressive move for a termination that's allegedly pending review. Okafor's voice had gone drier. Ms. Doan, I want to be straightforward with you. Commander Holt has been asking questions about your background, and some of what's come back has raised flags at our end. Not about you specifically, about the fact that certain records appear to have been recently accessed by an unauthorized party. I'm aware of that, Rachel said. A longer pause. How are you aware of that? The FBI visited me 3 days ago. Agent Voss? Rachel felt something settle in the back of her chest. Not comfort, confirmation. You know her. We've worked adjacent cases. Okafor paused. Ms. Doan, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. I'll give you what I can. Do you have reason to believe that Commander Holt's accident was not an accident? The question was careful and precise, and the fact that Okafor was asking it meant she'd already developed a reason of her own. Rachel thought about the subclavian bleed, the bone fragment, the pattern of the injury that she'd recognized from a context she hadn't let herself name in the trauma bay. I have no evidence, Rachel said. I have pattern recognition. That's an interesting way to put it. It's an accurate one. Okafor said, I'm going to pass your information up the chain. I'd strongly recommend you document everything you have and keep it somewhere that isn't your apartment. That last part was precise enough to be deliberate. Rachel noted it. Understood. And Ms. Doan? Okafor's voice didn't change pitch, but something behind it did. Don't sign anything Lund sends you. I wasn't planning to. By 2 p.m., the shape of the day had changed 3 times. That was the thing about a situation that had been static for 7 years suddenly going kinetic. The rate of change was disorienting even when you were trained for disorientation, because the specifics still surprised you, the texture of it, the way real events felt different from the scenarios you'd run in your head. She drove to the library, not her nearest branch, one across town, and used a computer there to look up Garrett Lund. He had a LinkedIn profile, a law firm website out of Cheyenne, and his name appeared in 3 SEC filings from the past 4 years in connection with a holding company called Veridan Health Partners. Veridan Health Partners had 17 subsidiary entities. 2 of them were connected to a defense logistics contractor called Merriam Solutions, LLC. Merriam Solutions, LLC had been incorporated in Delaware 8 years ago. Its original registered agent had been a man named Paul Costain. Paul Costain had died 5 years ago, but before that, he had worked for 16 years as the civilian contracts liaison for a military logistics division, a division that had been overseen at its peak operational period by a Colonel Owen Hale. She sat with that for a moment. Then she printed it. Then she used her phone to photograph the printouts and sent the photographs to Rice's number with a message that said, Miriam Solutions, Veridon, Costain, Hale. His reply came back in 4 minutes. Decker already has Miriam. This is bigger than we thought. She drove home a different way than she'd come. Not paranoia, practical. She'd been doing it for 7 years and it had become as automatic as checking the locks. The apartment felt different when she walked in. Not disturbed. Nothing was visibly out of place. But there was a quality to the air, a stillness that was one register too still. The kind you learned to notice when you'd spent time in environments where noticing was the difference between a bad day and no more days. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. Then she moved left, away from the center line, the way you do when the geometry of a space has potentially changed and you'd rather be wrong about it than right and exposed. She checked the apartment, methodically, without rushing. Every room, every closet, the bathroom, the second bedroom with its organized disorder. The safe was untouched. The burn phone was where she'd left it, but on the kitchen counter next to the notebook was a small white envelope she had not put there. She stood looking at it from the doorway of the kitchen. No handwriting on the outside, no postage. Someone had come in, put it on her counter, and left. The lock on her door showed no visible damage, which meant either it had been picked by someone competent or she had a key problem somewhere in her building. She picked up the envelope using the edge of her sleeve and opened it the same way. Inside was a single index card with 9 words typed on it in a clean sans serif font. You were supposed to stay buried. Next time you won't. She read it twice. Then she put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in the freezer behind the ice tray. Not for preservation, just for distance. A 6-inch buffer between the threat and the surface where she was trying to think, and called Rice. Someone was in my apartment, she said. When? In the last 3 hours. They left a note. Get out. I'm not running. Rachel? I'm not running, she said again, but I need you and Decker here. Can you make that happen? The pause this time was a different kind. Not hesitation, calculation. 24 hours. Make it 18. Okay. Then, what did the note say? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. That's not a professional threat. No. A professional threat doesn't use words like supposed to. His voice was thinking out loud now, working through it. That's personal. That's someone who's angry, not just someone who's following a protocol. Which means someone close to Hale, Rachel said. Not Hale himself. He doesn't get angry. He gets methodical. Someone who knows what you did before and resents that you've been left alone this long. Or someone who's been watching and is scared that the situation just changed. Both things could be true simultaneously. Usually were. 18 hours, Rice said. I'll be here. She hung up. She sat down at the kitchen table with the notebook and started a new page. She wrote down everything that had happened since the FBI visit in chronological order. The letter, Lund's call, Okafor's call, the library research, the envelope. She wrote down what she knew and what she suspected and where the 2 categories overlapped, which was increasingly everywhere. Then she wrote down Owen Hale's name at the top of a clean page and drew lines outward from it to everything she could connect. Miriam Solutions, Veridon Health Partners, Paul Costain, the defense logistics contracts, the shell company structure. And at the far end of one of the lines, the thing she hadn't written down yet, the classified unit that had refused an unlawful order in the Rayan Valley 8 years ago, and the 4 people from that unit who had died in the following 6 weeks in ways that were documented as accidents. She wrote their names. Dominic Farr, Asha Obi, Terrence Mallow, Jin Park. She hadn't written those names in 7 years. The act of writing them now felt like a small, precise violence. She held the pen for a moment after the last one. Then she kept writing. At 6:30 in the evening, her regular phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but it was a Colorado area code, and the call was short enough that she picked it up on the principle that most threats don't bother calling. Miss Doan. The voice was male, young, nervous in a specific way. Not scared nervous, caught out nervous, the way a junior staff member sounds when they're doing something they know could cost them. This is Paul Gregg. I'm a records coordinator at Callaway Regional. I shouldn't be calling. Okay, she said. I've been going through the administrative files since the suspension. It's part of the review process. I have legitimate access. I want to be clear about that. I understand. A breath. Ms. Doan, there's a pattern in the documentation that I don't think the complaints against you are real. I mean, they exist, the paperwork exists, but the dates don't line up with actual incidents. Some of them reference shifts you weren't even working. Rachel kept her voice neutral. Have you told anyone else? I was going to tell Dr. Paul, but then I found something else. Dr. Merritt's liability insurance. It was increased by a significant amount 6 days before Commander Holt's accident. 6 days before. Paul, she said carefully, where are you right now? I'm at work. I'm in the records room. Are you alone? A pause. Yes. Why? I need you to listen to me, she said. Make a copy of everything you just described. Don't use the hospital's system to copy it. Use your personal phone to photograph the documents if you have to. Then take those photographs and put them somewhere that isn't your work email and isn't your work phone. Okay. Then go home. Don't talk to Paul. Don't talk to Merritt. Don't tell anyone at the hospital that you called me. You think I'm in danger? His voice had gone smaller. She thought about the envelope in her freezer. She thought about Dominic Farr, whose accident had been a car crash on a dry road in good weather. I think being careful is worth more than being fast, she said. Can you do what I described? Yes. Then do it tonight. Don't wait. She hung up, sat still for 5 seconds, and then moved to the window. The street below was quiet. The sky was the particular shade of dark blue that came just before actual dark, when the air still held some daylight, but the shadows were committing to their final positions. Merritt's liability insurance increased 6 days before the accident. The subclavian injury pattern she'd recognized, the bone fragment occluding the bleed, the specific presentation that she'd seen in field conditions, twice, under circumstances that were not accidents. She stood at the window and let the implications settle. She'd assumed Marcus Holt had been asking questions that incidentally touched the network. She'd assumed he was peripheral, a commander who'd stumbled into the wrong moment on Route 9. She was revising that assumption now. The burn phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Rice. Decker pulled Holt's record. He was assigned to a DoD oversight committee 14 months ago. The committee was auditing defense logistics contracts. She read it twice. Then, one of the contracts under audit was Merriam Solutions. She stood very still. Holt hadn't stumbled into anything. Holt had been getting close, and someone had decided to take him off the board. And whoever that someone was had chosen a method that looked like an accident on a country road, and might have been, except for a nurse on a floor she wasn't supposed to be on, standing outside a trauma bay she'd been told to leave, who recognized a pattern she had no business recognizing and stepped forward anyway. The note in the envelope made more sense now. She hadn't just been a loose end from 7 years ago. She'd become an active variable in something that was already in motion. Her suspension wasn't a consequence of disrupting the trauma bay. It was a way to isolate her, to cut off her access to Holt before he could ask her directly what she knew and before she could ask him what he was getting close to. They'd been moving faster than she'd realized. She picked up the burn phone, texted Rice back. Change of timeline. Can you make it by morning? His reply came back in 2 minutes. Already driving. She went to the second bedroom. She moved the cardboard box of cables, opened the safe, and this time she took everything out of it. The burn phone she was already using, the document with the numbers, the photograph, still face down. She turned it over this time, looked at it for 4 seconds, turned it face down again. The ID card. And from beneath the false bottom of the safe, which she'd installed herself the month she moved in, she took out a folded piece of paper that was older than anything else in the apartment. She unfolded it carefully. It was a transcript, partial, handwritten by herself from memory, from a meeting she'd attended 8 years ago in a prefabricated command facility in a location that no longer appeared on any military record. The meeting where Owen Hale had given the order, the meeting where her unit had refused. The meeting she had no evidence of except this paper, her own handwriting, her own memory. But that was about to change. because Paul Grigg's photographs would exist by morning, and Danny Rice was somewhere on a New Mexico highway moving north, and Decker had 2 years of network mapping on Hale's financial structure. And somewhere in a federal building in Denver, a JAG officer had just gotten off the phone with her and passed information up a chain that ended eventually at a level where people had the authority to do things that individual nurses and combat medics and records coordinators could not. The shape of it was coming into view. Still dangerous, still fractured, still missing Margot, which was a gap that sat at the back of everything like a tooth that needed pulling, but visible. She folded the transcript back up, put it in her coat's inner pocket, and sat down to wait for morning. She'd been waiting, in one form or another, for 7 years. A few more hours wasn't the hardest thing she'd done. Outside, the street was fully dark now, and somewhere below her window, she didn't hear it so much as register it, the way you register a shift in pressure. A car pulled slowly to the curb across from her building and cut its lights. It sat there, engine idling, didn't move. She watched the car for 4 minutes. It didn't move. The engine idle was visible as a faint shimmer above the exhaust pipe. It was cold enough now that the heat was visible, and the driver's side window had a slight fog that told her there was one person in the vehicle, not two, and they were staying warm rather than staying invisible, which meant either they were bad at this or they wanted her to know they were there. She decided it was the latter. A message, then. Not an extraction team. Those didn't idle at the curb with their lights off for 4 minutes. A reminder. A pressure tactic. Someone making sure she understood that the walls of her quiet life in the city had already been mapped and could close at any time the people outside chose. She didn't close the curtain. She stepped back from the window and left the light on, because killing the light would tell them she'd clocked them, and she preferred to carry that advantage quietly. Then she went to the kitchen and made the coffee she hadn't made earlier, and stood at the counter with her back to the wall and the window in her peripheral line of sight and thought through the morning's shape. At 11:47, the car pulled away from the curb and drove north without accelerating. Unhurried, deliberate, a period at the end of a sentence. She noted the make and a partial plate and wrote both in the notebook. Then she went to bed. She slept 3 hours this time. It was enough. Reese arrived at 6:18 a.m. in a gray pickup truck with New Mexico plates and a crack in the passenger side windshield that he hadn't bothered to get fixed. He was thinner than she remembered, shorter-haired, and he had a new scar along his jaw that she clocked and didn't ask about. He came upstairs, looked at the apartment with the practiced inventory of someone who'd spent years entering unfamiliar spaces and making rapid assessments, then sat at the kitchen table and put a hard drive on it. "Decker's material," he said. "Where is he?" "Denver. He made contact with Okafor last night." He looked at her. "She's been building a case on the Merriam contracts for 6 months independently. She didn't know about us. She didn't know about Hale's history with the unit." Rachel sat down across from him. "When she finds out, she's going to want everything, yes." He pushed the hard drive toward her. "That's the question. How much do we give her and how fast?" "All of it," Rachel said. "We give her all of it." Rice looked at her for a moment. Not disagreement, more like he was checking if she'd thought it through. "That includes the transcript." "I know. If we hand that over formally, we lose control of how it moves. It goes up the chain, and we don't get to track it." "Danny." She said his name the way she used to in the field, when something needed to be said plainly without room for argument. 4 people died so that transcripts stayed buried. I've been carrying it in a safe for 4 years. It's done sitting there. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he nodded. One nod. Final. Okay. She plugged the hard drive into her laptop. Decker's files were organized the way Decker organized everything. Hierarchically, cross-referenced, the kind of structure that looked obsessive until you were trying to find a specific document at speed, and then it was the most useful thing in the world. He'd been building this for 2 years. Financial timelines, personnel movement records, contract renewals with procurement dates, a corporate tree that mapped Veridon Health Partners and Merriam Solutions, and 11 other entities back to a central holding structure that was, at its root, controlled by a trust established in Owen Hale's wife's name 6 months after Hale's retirement. A man who'd spent a career erasing other people's records had been meticulously documented by someone he'd tried to erase. He doesn't know about this? she said. Decker's been careful. Nothing connected to his real identity. Rice leaned over to look at the screen. There's one more thing. Scroll to the Holt folder. She scrolled. The folder contained a single PDF. It was a preliminary report from the DoD Oversight Committee that Holt had been serving on, 14 pages, heavily redacted in the version that had been officially circulated. But this was a pre-redaction draft pulled from a server backup that Decker had accessed through methods she chose not to examine closely. The unredacted sections named Merriam Solutions explicitly and described irregularities in 3 defense medical supply contracts worth a combined total of close to $40 million over 4 years. Merriam Solutions had been supplying field medical equipment to overseas operations. The equipment met procurement specifications on paper. In the field, it had failed at rates significantly above baseline: IV lines with compromised sterile seals, suture kits with inconsistent tensile strength, pressure bandages that didn't hold under thermal stress. Soldiers had died. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But some of them had died in ways that better equipment would have prevented, and the documentation of those deaths had been distributed across incident reports from 3 different operational commands, and nobody had connected the dots until a Navy commander on an oversight committee started asking why the same contractor kept getting renewed despite flagged performance data. She read the unredacted section twice, then she sat back. He was close, she said. He was about to recommend a formal audit request to the Inspector General's office. Rice's voice was flat. The accident happened 4 days before the committee's scheduled vote. 4 days. A steering column impact on Route 9, a subclavian bleed hiding behind a decoy wound, and a surgeon who'd been about to open the wrong side of a man's chest while the real source of the bleeding killed him from the inside. She thought about Merritt's liability insurance. Increased 6 days before the accident. Merritt knew, she said. Or he was positioned, paid to misread the injury on purpose, or just given enough financial cushion that the outcome of the trauma bay was insured either way. Rice shook his head. The insurance increase might be coincidence. It's not coincidence. No, he agreed. It's probably not. She closed the laptop. I need to get to Holt. The hospital has him flagged. I'm not going through the hospital. She stood up. He's a Navy commander under a JAG officer who's been building a case for 6 months. He has more authority in that hospital bed right now than Paul and Merritt combined, if someone reminds him of that. Okafor. Okafor. She picked up her regular phone. Can Decker stay with her? She needs to see the Holt folder. He's already there. Rice paused. Rachel. There's one more thing I haven't told you yet. She looked at him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his own phone, navigated to something, and set it on the table face up. It was a photograph. Bad quality, surveillance type, taken from a distance. A parking structure, maybe? 2 figures. One of them was a man in his 60s she recognized immediately. Owen Hale, heavier than she remembered, in civilian clothes, a jacket that looked expensive. The other figure was turned 3/4 away from the camera. Rachel looked at the second figure for a long time. When was this taken? She said. 5 days ago, Denver. She picked up the phone and looked at the photograph more closely. The second figure's posture, the way they stood, weight distribution, the tilt of the head. She'd cataloged that posture for years, in FOBs and debrief rooms and field conditions where the ability to identify a teammate by silhouette in low visibility was not a metaphorical skill. That's Margot, she said. Rice's jaw was tight. Yeah. She set the phone down. The implications arranged themselves in her chest in a cold, heavy way. 8 months of silence. Hale, in Denver, 5 days ago. Margot Seville, their former intelligence analyst, the person who knew the unit's structure, contact protocols, and the location of every piece of buried evidence better than anyone except Rachel herself. She could be compromised, Rachel said. She could be working for him voluntarily. Rice's voice was careful. Not accusing, just honest. She could have been flipped, could have been turned a long time ago. Or she's in trouble and that meeting wasn't her choice. We don't know. No, Rachel said, we don't. She thought about Margot. Not the possibility in the photograph, but the actual person, the analyst who'd spent 18 months embedded with their unit and had been the one to first flag the inconsistencies in Hale's order, the one who'd built the original evidentiary record that had then been confiscated and buried. The woman who'd looked at a colonel with a chest full of service ribbons and said, "This is wrong," before any of them had fully processed what they were being asked to do. She'd been wrong about things before. She'd been wrong about people. But she wasn't going to assume Margot Seville was a traitor based on a parking garage photograph. "We need to find her," Rachel said, "before Hale realizes we have this." Okafor called at 9:30. Her voice was different from the previous call, less formal, more direct, the manner of someone who'd spent the last 12 hours upgrading their assessment of a situation. "Your colleague in Denver is thorough," she said. "He's had time to work. The Holt folder is going to the IG's office today. I've already drafted the referral." A pause. "I need the transcript, Ms. Doan." "I know. It corroborates the command chain in Decker's financial timeline. Without it, what we have is circumstantial on the criminal conspiracy angle. Strong, but circumstantial. With it, we have Hale giving an unlawful order on record, and the subsequent deaths of the unit members who refused become something a prosecutor can work with." "4 people," Rachel said. "Dominic Farr, Asha Obi, Terrence Mallow, Jin Park." Okafor was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had shifted. Not softer, just more human. "I know. I'll bring you the transcript today, but I need something first." "What?" "I need access to Commander Holt. Supervised, whatever security level you need by him. I don't care. But I need to be in that room because there's something about his accident that isn't in any of the documentation, and I need to tell him directly." A brief pause. "The injury presentation?" "Yes." "Ms. Doan, that's going to be a hard conversation." "I know." She looked at the kitchen table, at the hard drive, at the notebook full of observations from a trauma bay she'd been escorted out of. "He deserves to know that what happened to him was deliberate. He deserves to hear it from someone who was in the room." Another pause, longer, then, 2 hours. "I'll have clearance arranged. Come to the hospital's administrative entrance and ask for me by name." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Okafor's voice returned to its baseline precision. "Things are moving faster than I'd like." "How fast?" "The financial records from Decker's drive triggered an automatic flag in the IG monitoring system when I entered them. That means somewhere an alert went out to whoever is watching those accounts." Rachel understood immediately. "They know we're moving." "We have a window. I don't know how wide it is." She hung up and looked at Rice. "We need to go now." He was already on his feet. The administrative entrance of Callaway Regional was on the building's north side, quieter than the main lobby, used mostly by contractors and staff. Okafor met them in the hallway outside the elevator bank. Late 30s, precise in movement and dress, with the watchfulness of someone who'd spent years in legal environments where inattention was expensive. She looked at Rice once, assessed him in the way trained people assessed each other, and said nothing about it. She took them up to the 4th floor. Holt was in a private room, which told Rachel that Okafor had already been making arrangements. He was sitting up in bed, still connected to monitoring equipment, a drainage line from the chest repair still in place, but upright, awake, his face carrying the particular expression of someone who'd been gathering information from a horizontal position and had run out of patience for it. He looked at Rachel when she came in, and something in his expression shifted. "I was wondering when you'd come in person," he said. His voice was still medication rough, but the command register was there under it, intact. "I had logistical complications," she said. "So I heard." He looked at Rice, then back at her. "You going to tell me what you found in the trauma bay?" She told him. She was direct and specific. The pressure curve, the bone fragment, the subclavian presentation, the pattern she recognized. She told him what that pattern meant and where she'd seen it before. She watched his face move through the information without flinching, absorbing it the way someone absorbs the confirmation of something they'd already suspected, which was worse in some ways than learning it fresh. "The committee vote," he said when she finished. 4 days. He looked at the window for a moment. His jaw was tight. Merit. We don't have direct evidence that he knew the injury was intentional, Rachel said. We have the insurance increase, and we have the fact that he was about to open the wrong side of your chest. Which you stopped. Yes. He was quiet, not processing. He'd already processed it, working out something else. Why are you here, Ms. Doan? You have Okafor. You have the financial trail. You don't need me to build the case. I need your testimony, she said, about the committee's work, the specific contracts you were auditing, the conversation you had before the vote was scheduled, and anything that might indicate who knew the committee was going to recommend the IG referral. That information is classified. Commander, she said it evenly. 4 people from my unit died so the man at the top of this network could stay operational for 8 more years. He was going to use your accident to reset the clock on the audit committee. If the IG referral goes up without your testimony connecting the committee's work to the contractor timeline, Hale's attorneys will argue the financial irregularities are coincidental to the criminal conspiracy. They'll sever the cases. He'll take the contract penalties and walk away from the murder charges. Holt looked at her for a long time. Your unit, he said. The classified one. Yes. That's who you were before. That's who I am, she said. I've just been quiet about it. He thought about it for about 10 seconds. Then he said, Get me a secure line to my JAG supervisor in Washington. If I'm going to breach classification, I'm doing it with a paper trail that protects my people. Okafor can arrange that. Then let's do it. He shifted in the bed, and the movement cost him. She could see it in the brief tightening around his eyes, the way he held the exhale. He didn't acknowledge it. What's the timeline? We have a window, Rachel said. We don't know how wide. Story of every operation I've ever run. He looked at her. What else do you need from me? Before she could answer, Okafor's phone went off. She looked at it, and something in her face changed, compact and controlled, but the change was visible. What is it? Rachel said. Okafor looked up. Paul Grigg, the records coordinator from Callaway. Rachel's chest went tight. What happened? He was found 40 minutes ago in the hospital's east stairwell. Okafor's voice was level in the way that level voices are when the speaker is deliberately managing what they're about to say. He's alive. He has a concussion and a broken wrist. His phone is missing. Rachel stood very still. His phone, she said. The photographs he took. Whoever took the phone, they know what he found. They know the documentation exists, and they know it's not on the hospital's system. Which meant they were already moving to contain it. Which meant they knew the window was closing. Which meant, Rice said quietly from behind her. Rachel? She turned. He was looking at his phone. His face was wrong. Not afraid. Rice didn't do afraid, but the specific expression of someone who has just received information that changes the calculation of everything currently in motion. Decker just sent a location ping, he said. Not a message. Just a ping. That was their protocol. 3 years ago, the 3 of them had agreed on it. A raw location ping with no message meant only one thing. It meant I am not in control of my situation, and this is my last opportunity to tell you where I am. She took Rice's phone and looked at the coordinates. They were 4 blocks from the federal building in Denver, where Decker had been with Okafor's documentation, where the IG referral had just been filed. He's been taken, Rachel said. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, somewhere in the gray Colorado morning, the window that Okafor had warned her about was closing, and the man who had spent 2 years building the evidentiary architecture of everything they were trying to do was somewhere in 4 blocks of downtown Denver, and Margot Seville was in a parking garage photograph with Owen Hale, and a records coordinator was in a hospital bed with a broken wrist and a missing phone. Rachel handed the phone back to Rice. We're going to Denver, she said. Okafor was already on her phone before Rachel finished the sentence. The drive to Denver was 2 hours 50 minutes in good conditions. Reese did it in 2 hours 12 by staying on the interstate and not discussing speed limits, while Rachel sat in the passenger seat with Decker's hard drive on her lap and worked through what they had, what they were missing, and what 4 blocks of downtown Denver looked like in terms of containment options for a man who'd just sent a last resort location ping. Okafor followed in her own vehicle. She'd made 3 calls before they left the hospital parking structure, and by the time they hit the on-ramp, she had confirmed 2 things. The IG referral had been successfully submitted before Decker went dark, and someone at the federal building had flagged an anomaly in the building's visitor log. A security contractor team had entered the building 40 minutes before the ping, using credentials that checked out on paper but had been issued to a company that, when Okafor ran the name, existed in a state of what she described as administrative ambiguity, which was her precise way of saying it was a shell. They were already in position, Rice said, eyes on the road. Before Decker arrived, Rachel said, they knew the referral was going in. The monitoring flag Okafor triggered when she uploaded Decker's files. Or someone inside the IG's office. Neither of them elaborated on that possibility. It sat between them like a third passenger. She called Decker's number 4 times on the way south, straight to voicemail each time, not ringing, which meant the phone was either off or destroyed. She tried the backup number, a secondary contact protocol they'd established 2 years ago, a prepaid line registered to a fictional equipment company in Tucson. That one rang twice and produced nothing. She put the phone away and looked at the road. Decker's real name was Aaron Blaine. He was 36, former Army intelligence, and had spent the last 4 years living in a suburb of Albuquerque under a cover identity that had never been officially revoked because the agency that would have revoked it had technically ceased to exist on paper 8 years ago, along with everything else connected to their unit. He had a daughter in Tucson from a relationship that had ended badly, and he sent her birthday cards under a false name because the alternative was no contact at all, which was worse. He was meticulous and careful and had been building a 2-year evidentiary case against Owen Hale in his spare time with the methodical dedication of someone who understood that the only way to bring down a man who controlled his own paper trail was to build a better one from the outside. Rachel thought about that as the mountains came into view south of Denver. She thought about what it meant that they'd taken him, and what it meant for the window Okafor had described, and what it meant in the simplest possible terms that Aaron Blaine was in a room somewhere with people who needed to know how much of his case had already moved beyond his possession. The IG referral was already filed. That couldn't be undone. But the hard drive she was holding contained everything Decker had built, and whoever had taken him would know the drive existed, and they would want it back or destroyed, and they would want to know who else had seen it. "We can't go in blind," she said. "I know." Reese took the exit toward downtown. "Okafor's people?" She said she had assets available. "I don't know what that means practically." "It means we find out when we get there." They parked in a structure 2 blocks from the coordinates Decker had pinged and met Okafor on foot at the corner of Aldine and 17th. She'd made more calls. Her face said the calls had produced mixed results. "I have 2 agents from the FBI's Denver field office meeting us," she said. "Agent Voss arranged it." Rachel looked at her. "Voss is here?" "She drove down this morning. Apparently she's been tracking the Merriam financial structure since before I was." Okafor's expression held something that wasn't quite professional irritation, but was close to it. The look of someone who'd been running a parallel investigation and was now dealing with the geometry of merging 2 separate operations under time pressure. "She has a theory about the security contractor team." "What theory?" "That they're not contractors, that they're active military, running an off-books operation under Hale's direct authorization. Which, if true, means this has escalated from financial fraud and conspiracy to an active military cover operation on domestic soil." Rice said something quiet under his breath, in the way that people do when the situation has exceeded the vocabulary available to them. "Where's Hale?" Rachel said. "Unknown. He dropped his known location profile 6 hours ago." Okafor looked at her phone. "Voss thinks he's in the city." Rachel looked at the street. The building that Decker's coordinates pointed to was a mid-rise commercial property, mostly office space, the kind of unremarkable downtown building that housed accounting firms and insurance offices, and had a parking structure attached to it that connected to the building across the alley. She'd looked it up on the drive down. The 14th floor had been leased 8 months ago to a company called Aldine Consulting Group, which was incorporated in Nevada and had 1 publicly listed employee, an office manager whose LinkedIn profile had been created 14 months ago and had no prior employment history. 14th floor, she said. Okafor nodded. Voss has the building's service entrance under watch. She's waiting on a warrant for entry. How long? 30 minutes, maybe 40. Rachel looked at the building, thought about Decker, who had a daughter in Tucson he sent birthday cards to from a false name. Thought about 30 or 40 minutes and what that interval meant for a man in a room with people who needed information that had already left his possession. He doesn't know the referral went through, she said. Whoever has him doesn't know. Okafor caught what she meant. If they believe the referral can still be pulled, they'll spend time trying to leverage him instead of... She stopped. I need to get a message to whoever is holding him. Not to him, to them. Okafor looked at her steadily. What kind of message? The kind that tells them the leverage doesn't exist anymore. She looked at Rice. Can you reach the IG's office directly? Get confirmation of the referral receipt in writing with a case number? Give me 10 minutes. You have 5. He stepped away from the group, phone out. Okafor was watching Rachel with the attentive expression of someone working out whether what was being proposed was reckless or strategically sound and landing somewhere uncertain between the two. You want to send them the confirmation? Okafor said. I want them to know that holding Decker buys them nothing. No leverage, no information advantage, no recoverable position. Rachel kept her voice even. The best possible outcome for them at that point is to not add federal kidnapping charges to everything else. And the worst? They decide he's a liability instead of an asset. Rachel looked at the building, which is why I need the confirmation in their hands before that calculation shifts. Rice came back in 4 minutes. He had a case number. What? Voss arrived on foot from the direction of the alley. Early 50s, still the same compact build and deliberate movement that Rachel had filed away from the apartment visit, but with a different quality to her now, less formal, operating rather than interviewing. She had 2 agents with her and a third-party communication channel already established with the building's private security desk on the ground floor. She looked at Rachel the way someone looks at a problem they've been working around a corner to reach. I was hoping we'd be doing this differently, she said. So was I, Rachel said. Did you get the confirmation number? Yes, it's going through building security to the 14th floor as a formal legal notification. Service a process, technically. The IG referral creates an automatic preservation order for any entities named in the filing, which Aldine Consulting Group is, tangentially, through the Veridon chain. Voss paused. It's not a conventional service. Their attorneys will argue it on a technicality. I don't need it to hold in court. I need it to change the math in that room. It might. Voss didn't sound convinced, but she also didn't sound like she had a better option ready. And if it doesn't? Then we use the warrant when it comes through. Rachel looked up at the building. But I'd rather Decker walk out on his own before then. It took 11 minutes. She counted them standing on the corner, watching the building entrance, running through contingencies the way she'd spent years running through contingencies. Not because the exercise guaranteed outcomes, but because the discipline of it meant you were never starting from zero when things moved. At the 11-minute mark, the building's main entrance opened, and Aaron Blaine walked out. He was walking carefully, which meant something had happened to his ribs or his midsection. He had that specific gait, the breath management gait of someone protecting a damaged side. His left eye was beginning to close. He had no jacket. He walked to the edge of the sidewalk and stopped and looked at the street with the expression of someone performing a rapid environmental scan, which was what he was doing. Rachel crossed the street. He saw her when she was 20 feet away, and something in his face did the thing faces do when the relief is physical before it's emotional. A brief, involuntary relaxation of the muscles around the eyes and jaw that happened before conscious thought caught up with it. The IG number, he said. They got it, and then they got a call. What kind of call? From someone above Hale. His voice was tight with the rib pain he was managing. Someone above Hale told them to stand down. Rachel looked at him. Stand down. Not release you. Not contain you. Stand down entirely. They just opened the door. He looked back at the building with something that wasn't quite confusion and wasn't quite relief. Something broke loose up the chain, something bigger than what we filed. Voss was beside them now. Her phone was out and she was reading something on it with an expression Rachel had not seen on her face before. The specific look of someone receiving information that confirms and exceeds their worst-case scenario simultaneously. "What is it?" Rachel said. Voss looked up. The monitoring flag from Okafor's filing last night didn't just go to Hale's network. She turned the phone toward Rachel. It went to a separate monitoring system at the Pentagon, a counterintelligence unit that has been running its own track on the Merriam contracts for 16 months. Rachel read the message on the screen. Twice. "They've been watching Hale," she said. "They've been watching the network. They weren't tracking Hale specifically. They were tracking the money, and Hale was at the center of the map, but they didn't have the command chain evidence to connect him to the original criminal conspiracy." Voss pulled the phone back. "They do now. The transcript, the Rayon Valley order, the unit, it connects the financial fraud to a decade-old chain of command violation and the subsequent deaths. That's what the people in that building received." She looked at the building. "That's why they stood down." Rice said from behind Rachel, "Who made the call to them?" Voss's expression held something complicated. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Owen Hale was arrested at 2:17 p.m. at a private airfield 40 minutes south of Denver. Rachel was not there for it. She heard it the way she'd heard a lot of things in the past week. Through intermediaries, phone calls, secondhand accounts that she assembled into a coherent picture the way she'd learned to assemble field intelligence, with the understanding that the first reports were always partial and the full picture took time, and that the partial picture was still better than nothing. What she knew by 4 p.m. Hale had been attempting to board a private aircraft when a joint team of military counterintelligence agents and FBI personnel took him into custody. He had reportedly said nothing. The accounts differed on the small details, whether he'd been calm or agitated, whether his attorneys had been present or were en route, but on the central fact they agreed. He was in federal custody, and this time the chain of events that placed him there was documented so thoroughly and from so many independent directions that the mechanisms he'd used to stay operational for a decade had no surface left to grip. The Pentagon Counterintelligence Unit made formal contact with Okafor at 3 p.m. Their representative was a colonel named Wendell Strick, who spoke with the precise, layered manner of someone who chose every word as a tactical placement. He confirmed what Voss's message had indicated and added one detail that Voss had not yet received. The monitoring system that had flagged Okafor's filing had been established specifically in response to a congressional request for oversight of post-service contractor activity by flag-grade officers, a request that had been made 18 months ago and had so far produced nothing actionable. Until now. "The transcript," Strick said, looking at Rachel across a table in a conference room at the federal building that Decker had entered that morning under very different circumstances. "The Rayon Valley order. Is the original still intact?" "The original is what I wrote from memory," Rachel said. "The night after the meeting. It was never recorded." "Your testimony, then?" "And the testimony of 2 other surviving members of the unit who were present." She looked at him. "And Commander Holt, who can testify to the nature of the DoD committee's work and what they found in the Merriam contracts." Strick looked at the table for a moment. He had the expression of someone adding up columns. "The criminal conspiracy case and the contract fraud case were being built separately," he said. "Your evidence connects them through Hale's command structure." "Yes." "That makes him liable at 2 separate federal levels simultaneously." "I know," Rachel said. He looked at her, not with the assessing quality that Voss had used during the apartment visit. Something more direct than that. "Ms. Doan, you've been living under a suppressed identity for 7 years carrying a transcript that could have ended this. Why wait?" It was a fair question. She'd been asking it herself for 7 years, in the quiet of the Carver Street apartment and on the river trail and in the seconds before sleep. "Because I didn't want to end it halfway," she said. "I wanted to be sure that when it moved far enough that he couldn't close it again." Strick was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "Now there's a Navy commander with a repaired subclavian and a documented record of what Merriam Solutions cost him. There's a records coordinator with a broken wrist and photographs that are on a server Greg sent them to before his phone was taken. There's a 2-year financial map that an Army intelligence veteran built in his living room in New Mexico. And there's a counterintelligence unit that's been waiting 16 months for a connection it didn't have. She looked at him steadily. It's moved far enough. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Chab. The next 72 hours were not clean. Nothing about the process was clean. There were jurisdictional frictions between the FBI, the Military Counterintelligence Unit, and the IG's office that produced delays and redundancies, and at one point a 3-hour standoff over which agency had primary evidence custody of Decker's hard drive. There were attorneys, Hale's attorneys, and the attorneys for Merriam Solutions and Veridan Health Partners, who began issuing statements within hours of the arrest, asserting that their clients were cooperating with investigators and that any suggestion of wrongdoing was premature. Statements that became progressively shorter and less assertive over the course of the following day as the evidentiary picture continued to expand. Merritt was interviewed by FBI agents on the evening of the first day. He arrived with an attorney and emerged from the interview 2 hours later without one, which was less because the attorney had left, and more because the attorney had been retained for a different kind of proceeding. Merritt's liability insurance increase was formally entered into the evidentiary record. His communications records for the 6 weeks prior to Holt's accident were subpoenaed. Gregory Paul received a visit from federal agents at his home on the evening of the second day. He was not arrested. He had been a conduit rather than an architect, someone who'd made administrative decisions under pressure without fully understanding the shape of what he was serving. That distinction mattered, and Rachel was not interested in Paul's career outcomes so much as she was interested in what he knew about who had given him the instructions he'd followed. Paul knew more than she'd expected. He gave it in exchange for a cooperation agreement. The name he provided, the name of the person within Callaway Regional's board of directors who had been receiving payments from Veridan Health Partners in exchange for administrative decisions that served the network's interests, was a name Rachel didn't recognize, which told her that Hale's structure had been sufficiently distributed that even the people carrying its weight hadn't known the full architecture. That was good. That meant the weight had no single point of transfer. It meant that as each person flipped, they provided a new thread, and the unraveling was genuinely systemic rather than a single chain being pulled. Decker's ribs were bruised, not broken. He was evaluated at a Denver hospital and released with instructions to rest, which he did not follow. He was at the federal building reviewing his own financial documentation with investigators for 11 hours on the second day, stopping periodically to shift in his chair with a controlled expression that said the pain was present and he was managing it, and he would rather be doing this than anything else available to him right now. On the third day, Rachel drove to Denver alone. Not for any operational reason. The operational phase was, in the practical sense, in other hands now. Investigators and attorneys and federal coordinators doing the work that federal investigators and attorneys and coordinators do. Her role had shifted from active to evidential, which was a shift she understood and had been prepared for and which still felt, in the body, like a different kind of waiting from the waiting she'd done for 7 years. She drove to Denver because Margot Seville was there. Margot had surfaced on the second day. Not dramatically. She'd called Okafor directly, identified herself by her actual name, and stated that she'd been operating under duress for 11 months and wanted to come in. The parking garage photograph, it turned out, had been taken during a meeting Margot had not attended voluntarily. Hale had found her 2 years ago, not through the contact protocols which she'd been careful with, but through a background trace on a veterinary clinic she'd been working at in Fort Collins under a cover identity. A trace that had been run by a former colleague who'd been working for Hale without Margot's knowledge at the time she'd confided in him about the clinic. Hale had used what he knew to control what she did. He hadn't needed her to actively betray the unit. He just needed her present and visible at intervals, a living reminder that he could reach anyone he chose to reach, and that the quiet they'd all built for themselves was a gift he'd allowed them, not a condition he couldn't change. She'd been feeding him surface-level information, the kind that confirmed what he already knew without advancing his position, while waiting for a moment when the situation moved fast enough that she could step out of it without him having time to respond. That was how Rachel understood it, sitting across from Margot in a federal building conference room on the third day. The account was coherent and the reasoning was sound, and there were verifiable gaps in the information Margot had provided to Hale that supported her claim of deliberate misdirection. All of that was true, and Rachel processed it as true. She also looked at Margot across the table and understood that the 11 months had cost her in ways that weren't visible in any evidentiary review. "You should have called me," Rachel said. "I know." Margot's voice was flat in the specific way of someone who had been having arguments with themselves about a decision for a long time. "I thought if I called you, he'd use it to move on all three of you at once. If I stayed in it alone, at least it was contained. You were carrying it alone for 11 months. You carried the transcript for 7 years. Rachel held her gaze. "That's different." "Is it?" Margot looked at the table. "I'm not sure it is, actually." They sat with that for a moment. It wasn't comfortable, and Rachel didn't try to make it comfortable. Some accounting needed to happen between them. Not accusation, not absolution, just the honest acknowledgement of what the past 7 years had asked each of them to carry, and whether it had been distributed well. And the answer to that was no, it hadn't been. And that was on all of them, including Rachel, who had spent 4 years sitting on a transcript and calling it strategic patience. "Rice is outside," Rachel said finally. Margot's expression shifted, just slightly. "I figured." "He's not angry." "He was always bad at angry." A pause. "Is he okay?" "He drove 18 hours and has been running on 4 hours sleep for 3 days. So physically, no. Otherwise," Rachel thought about it. "He said your name like it was information he'd been waiting to confirm." Margot looked at the door. Rachel stood up. "Come on," she said. By the end of the week, the federal case had expanded to include 14 named defendants across the Merriam-Veridon network. Hale remained at the center. His attorneys, after reviewing the evidentiary scope, had begun the preliminary conversations that preceded a negotiation that everyone in the room understood was not going to produce the outcome Hale's side wanted, because the evidentiary scope was too broad and too independently sourced for a negotiation to close it. Callaway Regional's board of directors issued a statement announcing an internal review of administrative practices. 2 board members resigned before the review began, which was noted by the FBI and by several journalists who had begun covering the story through the publicly available records from the IG referral. Merritt's hospital privileges were suspended pending investigation. The suspension was announced internally, which was where it ended for approximately 18 hours, after which a journalist from the Denver Post, who had been making inquiries since the Holt story broke, published a piece connecting Merritt's insurance increase to the timeline of Holt's accident. Merritt did not comment. His attorney commented, briefly, in terms that were careful enough to be their own story. On the 7th day after Hale's arrest, Rachel drove back to Delhart. She drove the same route she always drove, past the same gas station and the same grain elevator and the same intersection where the light had been broken for 3 months. The mountains were visible today, the flat gray lid of cloud from the morning she'd been suspended, finally gone. The peaks clear and sharp against a cold blue sky. She parked on Carver Street and sat in the car for a moment. Her phone showed 17 unread messages, 6 missed calls, and an email from an address she didn't recognize with a subject line that said, "Formal communication. Rachel Doan / unit designation. Redacted. Please confirm receipt." She looked at the subject line for a long time. She knew what a formal communication from a military counterintelligence unit in the subject line looked like. She knew what it meant when the unit designation in the subject line was redacted, which was how these things were handled when the designation in question was being formally restored rather than formally buried. She also knew what Strick had been moving toward at the end of their conference room conversation, when she'd told him it had moved far enough, and he'd held her gaze in the way he had, and nodded. She opened the email. She read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly, and the particular quality of the silence in the car shifted into something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter than both of those and more structural, like a load-bearing wall being reset into its correct position after years of the building working around its absence. She was still reading it when her regular phone rang. Okafor. She picked up. "I'm assuming you just received the communication," Okafor said. "Yes." "There's a second component." Okafor paused, not dramatically, just the natural pause of someone who is checking that the next thing they say lands in the right sequence. Commander Holt has formally requested that you be assigned as a civilian medical consultant to the Oversight Task Force that the Counterintelligence Unit is standing up. The task force that will be running the prosecution support for the Hale case and auditing the Merriam contract fallout across the other defense logistics contracts that are now under review. Rachel sat with that. How many other contracts? She said. 17 currently, possibly more as the scope expands. 17 contracts. The equipment failures across 3 operational commands. The incident reports distributed to prevent anyone from seeing the pattern. The soldiers who died in ways that better equipment would have prevented. When do they need an answer? She said. They'd like one by Monday. Okafor's voice was dry in the specific way it got when she was being precise about something that had a subtext. Though Colonel Strick indicated he considers your acceptance to be a formality, which tells you something about how confident he is. It tells me he doesn't know me very well yet, Rachel said. That's what I told him. A pause. Ms. Doan. Rachel. The first name was deliberate, a shift Okafor made carefully. What you did in that trauma bay, what you carried for 7 years. I want to say something before this becomes official and everything gets formal. Okay. It mattered. The way you did it, staying, even when it cost you, even when it was easier to stay buried. That's what made the difference between this going somewhere and this going nowhere for another decade. A beat. I wanted to say that before the paperwork turns you into a case asset. Rachel looked through the windshield at Carver Street. The woman with the dog was out again. Different route today, the dog still moving badly on that hip, the woman adjusting her pace without looking down, just automatically accommodating what needed accommodating. Thank you, Rachel said. She meant it, and Okafor's brief silence said she understood that. Monday, Okafor said. Think about it. Rachel hung up. She sat in the car another few minutes. Then she got out, went upstairs, unlocked her apartment, and stood in the middle of the living room the way she had the afternoon of the suspension, looking at the middle distance, the space where the quiet life she'd built had existed until a week ago. The apartment looked the same. The hooks by the door, the kitchen counter, the second bedroom with its organized disorder, the freezer, which still had an envelope in it behind the ice tray that she needed to deal with at some point, because the FBI had asked about any physical threats, and she'd said she'd provide what she had. She went to the second bedroom. She moved the cardboard box, opened the safe, already half empty, the ID card still sitting there, and took out the photograph she'd turned face down twice before. She turned it face up. 4 people. A FOB in the Rayan Valley. 2 of them standing, 2 crouching in front. Dominic Farr and Jin Park standing, Asha Obi and Terrence Mallow in front, all of them in the low-quality outdoor light of a field photograph taken on a disposable camera by someone standing to the left of the group whose shadow fell across the right edge of the frame. Rachel had been the one standing to the left. She'd kept this photograph for 8 years and turned it face down for most of them. Not because looking at it was unbearable, she'd been trained to function under worse than memory, but because looking at it had felt like a promise she wasn't ready to make. And not looking at it had felt like the only honest option when she didn't know if she'd ever be in a position to keep it. She was in that position now. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she put it face up in the safe and left the door of the safe open. Her phone buzzed. A text from Rice. Decker says he's putting in for something called a rest day. I told him that was a thing normal people do, and he looked confused. How'd the Okafor call go? She typed back. Well, tell Decker to rest his ribs. A pause. Then, you gonna take it? She looked at the open safe, the photograph face up, the ID card with a name she hadn't used in 7 years and was beginning to think about using again. She typed, Monday. His reply came back in 10 seconds. That's a yes. She put the phone in her pocket. She went to the kitchen and made coffee, and this time she drank it while it was still hot, standing at the window with the mountains visible over the rooftops of Carver Street for the first time in days. The light on the peaks doing what late afternoon light does at this elevation, going gold briefly before the cold came back in. Somewhere in a federal holding facility south of Denver, Owen Hale was sitting with his attorneys and the evidentiary record of a decade's worth of decisions he'd made under the assumption that the people he'd buried would stay buried. He was finding out now what buried people do when they finally decide they're done being quiet. And Rachel was standing at a kitchen window in Delhart, Colorado, drinking hot coffee in her own apartment, which was still standing, which still had her things in it, which was more than 4 people she'd photographed in a valley 8 years ago could say. She thought about Monday. She thought about 17 contracts and the soldiers in the incident reports and the equipment that had failed under conditions it was certified to survive. She set the mug down. She went to the kitchen table, opened the notebook to a fresh page, and started writing. She wrote for 3 hours. Not the operational kind of writing, not timelines or evidentiary catalogs or contact protocols. She wrote names. Not Hale's name, not Merritt's, not the 14 defendants currently working through federal processing in Denver. She wrote Dominic Farr's name, and Asha Obi's, and Terrence Mallow's, and Jin Park's, and beside each name she wrote what she remembered about them that had nothing to do with the Rayan Valley or the order they'd refused or the manner of their deaths. Dominic had kept a paperback novel in every jacket pocket, rotating titles, always mid-book, always ready to read 3 pages in any downtime longer than 4 minutes. She couldn't remember the last title she'd seen him reading. She wrote that down. The forgetting as well as the fact. Asha had been from outside Columbus and had a laugh that seemed architecturally incompatible with the size of her frame. Too big, too sudden, startling people at tables around her in mess halls who would then laugh themselves without knowing why. Terrence had made bad coffee deliberately, as a form of protest against something he'd never adequately explained, and had been aggressively proud of it. Jin had sent his mother a postcard from every country he'd operated in, using a cover story about travel photography, and his mother had put them on her refrigerator in a grid and told her neighbors her son had the most interesting job. She wrote all of it. She wrote it because in 7 years of operational caution and strategic patience, she'd been so focused on the evidentiary record of how they died that she'd let the factual record of how they lived get thin. And that was a different kind of burial, quieter and more personal, and no less real for being unintentional. When she was done, she closed the notebook and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. She'd lost track of the light, and let the quiet be what it was, which was not peace exactly, more like the specific texture of a room after something heavy has been set down in it. Then she opened her laptop and replied to Strick's email. She wrote, "Confirmed receipt. I'll be available Monday. There are conditions I'd like to discuss before formal assignment. R. Doan." She thought about it for a moment, then added, "The unit members who survive should be offered parallel consultant status if they want it. That's the first condition." She sent it before she could qualify it further. The federal trial of Owen Hale and 11 co-defendants opened 4 months later in a federal courthouse in Denver on a Tuesday in early spring, when the city was still deciding between winter and something else, and the air had that unresolved quality of a system that hadn't committed to its next move. Rachel sat in the 3rd row of the gallery on the first day. Not because she was required to be there. Her testimony was scheduled for the 2nd week, but because she'd waited a long time for the beginning of this, and she wanted to see the beginning of it. Hale entered the courtroom the way he'd spent his career entering rooms, like a man who had a right to the space, shoulders back, chin level, the bearing of military service worn so deep into the musculature that it persisted even in a suit, even under federal indictment, even after 4 months in which the architecture of the network he'd built had been dismantled piece by piece in courtrooms and congressional offices and IG proceedings, and the pages of 3 major newspapers that had covered the story with the sustained energy that investigative reporters bring to a case when the documentation is clean and the scope keeps expanding. He sat at the defense table and did not look at the gallery. Rachel watched him anyway. She'd thought, at various points over the past 4 months, about what it would feel like to be in the same room with him again. She'd last seen him in the Rayan Valley, across a table in a prefabricated command facility, in the moment after he'd given the order and she and the others had said no. He'd looked at them the way powerful people look at obstacles they consider temporary. He'd said, "You'll regret this." He'd said it with the confidence of a man who had enough institutional authority to make his predictions self-fulfilling, and for 8 years he'd been right. Now he sat at a defense table with 4 attorneys and the documented record of a decade's worth of decisions, and Rachel watched him and felt something she hadn't fully anticipated. Not the clean satisfaction of narrative resolution, not the hot feeling of vindication, but something more complicated and more honest than either of those. An accounting. The word that kept coming to her was accounting, not in the legal sense, but in the older, plainer sense, a ledger being brought into balance. A column of figures that had been running in one direction for a long time, turning. The prosecutor's opening statement laid the case in broad strokes: conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, the 4 deaths from her unit cataloged by name and manner, and evidence of deliberate orchestration. She heard Dominic Farr's name read aloud in a federal courtroom and felt a particular interior shift of something being moved from one category to another, from buried to recorded, from private to public, from the kind of fact that existed only because she carried it to the kind that existed in transcripts and dockets, and was now, irrevocably, part of the formal record of what had happened. She didn't cry. That wasn't available to her in this room, in this posture, after this long. What she did was breathe and hold herself steady and listen to every word. She testified on the 9th day of trial. She'd prepared with the federal prosecutors for 3 sessions across 2 weeks, going through the Rayon Valley meeting in detail. The order Hale gave, the specific language he used, the nature of the operation he was directing the unit to carry out, which was the seizure and destruction of evidence related to a military contractor inspection that would have exposed the nascent Merriam structure before it was established. She'd prepared for the cross-examination, which the defense had telegraphed in their preliminary filings as an attempt to characterize her testimony as the self-serving account of a disgruntled former service member operating from personal grievance. She'd thought about how to handle that framing for a long time. She'd talked to Rice about it, and Rice had said something that was useful in the way practical things were useful. Just say what you saw. They can try to build a story around it, but they can't change what you saw. She sat in the witness stand and said what she saw. She said it in the same flat, precise register she used when she was reading a monitor in a trauma bay, or cataloging supply inventory, or doing any of the other tasks that people at Callaway Regional had considered adequately suited to her capabilities. She didn't perform certainty. She didn't need to, because certainty wasn't what she was offering. She was offering recollection and documentation and pattern recognition trained over years in contexts that had demanded accuracy, because inaccuracy had consequences she'd seen in person. The defense attorney who cross-examined her was skilled. He was the kind of skilled that had clearly worked in other contexts. He had a technique of implying imprecision without directly asserting it, a way of asking questions that suggested the witness was confusing interpretation for fact. He spent 40 minutes on the temporal distance between the Rayon Valley meeting and her testimony. He spent 20 minutes on the circumstances of her suppressed identity and what he called the selective nature of her disclosure. She answered every question with the same register she'd walked in with. She didn't get angry. She didn't get uncertain. She didn't give him anything to work with that he hadn't already brought himself. At one point he asked, "Ms. Doan, isn't it true that your personal animus toward Colonel Hale could reasonably be expected to influence your recollection of events from 8 years ago?" She looked at him. "I have documentation," she said. "The animus is beside the point." He tried 3 more angles after that. None of them landed differently. When she stepped down from the witness stand, she walked back through the gallery to her seat in the 3rd row, and she was aware of the room in the peripheral way she was always aware of rooms. The weight of attention, the specific quality of a space that has been listening, and she sat down and looked forward and did not look at Hale. She didn't need to. The verdict came 6 weeks after closing arguments, guilty on all primary counts. Owen Hale, conspiracy, fraud, obstruction of justice, 4 counts of murder in the 2nd degree connected to the deaths of the unit members, and a separate count of unauthorized use of military authority in connection with the contractor operation in the Rayon Valley. Sentencing was scheduled for 8 weeks out. 3 co-defendants had pled guilty during the trial. 2 others were convicted on the reduced charges their attorneys had negotiated. The remaining defendants received verdicts that ranged across the charging structure, depending on their depth in the network and the quality of the cooperation agreements they'd made during the pretrial period. Silas Merritt was not a trial defendant, so his case was being prosecuted separately, under a different charging structure focused on the liability insurance fraud and the questions about his conduct in Holt's trauma bay, the answers to which had become significantly clearer during the trial's evidentiary phase. His hospital privileges had been permanently revoked. His medical license was under review by the state board. He had issued one public statement through his attorney and had not spoken since. Gregory Paul had cooperated fully. His cooperation had been noted in the court record and would factor into his own proceeding, which Rachel understood and didn't have strong feelings about. Paul had been weak under pressure, which was a human failure and a costly one, but weakness wasn't the same as the architecture of deliberate harm that Hale had built over a decade, and she'd learned a long time ago that the useful thing wasn't to treat every failure as equivalent, but to understand the difference between the people who built systems of harm and the people who got caught in them and made bad choices about how to survive. Callaway Regional's board had been reconstituted. 3 members had resigned, 2 had been removed following the internal review. The hospital had issued a formal statement acknowledging the wrongful termination of Rachel Doan and expressing, in the careful language of institutional legal exposure, something that wasn't quite an apology, but occupied the same zip code. She hadn't responded to the statement and didn't plan to. An institution apologizing for itself was something to note and move past, not something to negotiate with. The military memorial was held on a Saturday in late May at a facility outside Colorado Springs where the mountains were visible in every direction and the light in the morning had the specific quality of high-altitude spring, clean and cold-edged, the kind of light that made everything look like it had just been placed. The ceremony was military in structure and form, dress uniforms, protocol, a precision to the proceedings that Rachel understood and that the families present perhaps found either comforting or alien, depending on their history with the institution. 4 families: parents, siblings, one spouse, children who had been small when their parent died and were now old enough to stand at attention and understand some portion of what they were being told. The memorial wall had new engravings, 4 names that had been absent from the official record for 8 years, restored now by a formal military review process that had taken 4 months and generated 200 pages of documentation and had concluded in the unambiguous language of official finding that the members of the unit designated in the classified record had been unlawfully ordered, had lawfully refused, and had subsequently died as a result of deliberate acts directed by a superior officer, acts that were now part of a criminal conviction and a permanent federal record. Rachel stood at the wall and looked at the names. She'd thought about this moment in various forms over 8 years. She'd thought about what she'd feel and what she'd say to herself and whether the formal recognition would do what formal recognition was supposed to do. Close something, settle something, provide the kind of institutional acknowledgement that the families in particular had needed since the first fabricated accident report landed in their mailboxes. What she actually felt, standing at the wall on a Saturday morning in late May, was imperfect and complicated and resistant to summary, which felt right to her in a way that clean catharsis would not have. She felt the weight of the 7 years. She felt the specific grief of Dominic's paperback novels, and Asha's outsized laugh, and Terrence's deliberately bad coffee, and Jin's postcards on his mother's refrigerator. She felt something that wasn't exactly anger at the time lost. Anger at what specifically, at whom specifically, when the man responsible was sitting in federal custody waiting for sentencing, but was adjacent to it, a residue, the emotional equivalent of the bruise that remains after the initial injury heals. She felt, underneath all of that, and holding all of it up, something she could only call relief. Not the relief of a threat removed, but the relief of a truth finally located in the place where it was supposed to be, in the record, in the stone, in the air of a morning where other people could hear it. Rice stood beside her. He'd come in dress uniform, which he hadn't worn in years, and it fit differently than it once had. He'd lost the bulk of the military years and then put some of it back differently, and the jacket sat on him like a garment that remembered a previous version of its owner. He didn't say anything at the wall. Neither did she. Decker stood to her left, his ribs fully healed now, his expression doing the thing it did when he was processing something in the internal, systematic way he processed everything, quietly, thoroughly, without much visible surface movement. He'd brought his daughter from Tucson. She was 11, with his same systematic attentiveness and her mother's coloring, and she stood next to him, holding his hand in the way children hold the hands of parents. They're not quite sure need the comfort, or are offering it. Margot stood at the end of the row. She and Rachel had talked, over the 4 months of the trial's preparation and proceedings, in the way people talk when they are rebuilding something that was damaged not by conflict, but by circumstance, which was a slower and more uncertain process than rebuilding after conflict, because the damage was harder to locate and the repair harder to verify. They hadn't resolved everything. Some things were still in the category of things that needed more time than 4 months. But Margot had testified at trial, concisely and precisely, and the account she'd given of her 11 months under Hale's pressure had added a dimension to the case that the financial records alone couldn't provide. The dimension of what it looked like from inside the mechanism. The human cost of a network that maintained itself through intimidation and the exploitation of people who had already sacrificed too much to have leverage over. Rachel looked at her across the row. Margot looked back. Neither of them smiled. That wasn't the right shape for the moment. But something passed between them that was close to acknowledgement, the specific kind that doesn't need language because language would make it smaller. The families moved toward the wall. Jin's mother, who was in her 70s and had traveled from outside Portland, reached up and put her hand on her son's name and stood there with her hand flat against the stone, and Rachel looked away because some things were not hers to watch. 3 weeks after the memorial, Hale was sentenced. 22 years, federal prison, no parole eligibility until the 15th year. Rank stripped, pension forfeited. Every commendation, every decoration, every piece of official recognition that his career had accumulated was removed from the record in a process that was bureaucratic and thorough, and, in its quiet way, as complete as anything Rachel had seen the justice system produce. He said nothing at sentencing. His attorneys had advised against a statement, and for once he had followed advice that didn't originate with his own judgment of his own position. He walked out of the courtroom with the same bearing he'd walked in with, which Rachel thought was the most revealing thing about him, that even at the end, the posture was a performance sustained beyond the point where it served any purpose, a habit so deep it ran on its own regardless of the situation it was operating in. She watched the sentencing on a live stream feed from the new office, a small room in a federal building in Denver that smelled like carpet adhesive and had a window overlooking a parking structure, furnished with a government-issued desk and 2 chairs and a whiteboard that she'd already filled one side of. The Oversight Task Force had a staff of 7. Herself, Decker on secondment as a data analyst, 2 JAG officers, a federal investigator from the IG's office, and 2 administrative coordinators who were aggressively competent in the way that junior federal staff were when they'd been placed with a unit that was actually going to use them. Rice had declined the formal appointment. He'd said, characteristically briefly, that he was better as a loose asset than a salaried one, and that he'd be available when she needed him, and that she should send him anything that needed a field read because he was tired of New Mexico and needed a reason to drive. She'd said she'd hold him to that. He'd said she wouldn't need to. Margot had taken a different position. She'd moved into the IG's office itself, working on the structural side of the contractor oversight review, which suited her analytical background better than anything field-adjacent would have. They talked on the phone every week or 2. The conversations were still finding their shape, but they were happening, which was more than Rachel had allowed herself to expect 4 months ago. The 17 contracts were now 23, as the scope of the Merriam audit expanded into adjacent procurement channels that Decker's financial mapping had flagged. The work was specific and unglamorous, and produced results in the incremental way that systemic work produces results. Not in dramatic reversals, but in the slow accumulation of corrections that changed the underlying conditions rather than just the surface outcomes. That was the work. Rachel had understood what she was signing up for, and she found, in the day-to-day texture of it, that understanding it in theory and experiencing it in practice were the same thing, which was not always true, and was, when it was true, worth noting. In June, Callaway Regional's new administrative director called Rachel directly. Not through attorneys, not through formal correspondence. Her name was Adria Van, appointed after the board reconstitution, and she had the particular quality of someone who'd taken a job in full knowledge of the rubble she was inheriting and had decided that knowing about the rubble was the job, rather than a preliminary obstacle to it. She said, "I know you have no reason to do us any favors." "No," Rachel agreed. "We're trying to build something that doesn't repeat what happened. I don't think we can do that without talking to the people who saw what happened from inside it." Rachel thought about that for a moment. "What do you want from me specifically?" "An honest account of what the culture looked like from the floor. Not for legal purposes. We're past that. For the purpose of understanding what conditions allowed it." "That's a hard thing to hear." "I'm aware. I'll think about it." She did think about it for 2 weeks. And then she drove to Delhart on a Wednesday and walked into Callaway Regional through the front entrance, not the ambulance bay, and met Adria Van in a conference room that was not the room where Gregory Paul had sat across from her with his theatrical manila folder and told her she was being suspended for disrupting the trauma bay. She talked for an hour and a half. She said what she saw, the same way she'd said it on the witness stand, flat, precise, without softening and without performance. She said what the culture of hierarchical dismissal had produced in practical terms, what it had cost in missed catches and suppressed observations and the slow attrition of floor staff who noticed things and learned eventually to notice them quietly or not at all. Van listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been in Rachel's experience of people in administrative positions. At the end, Van said, "If you're ever willing to do this in a formal capacity, training, consultation, I'd like to have that conversation." "I already have a formal capacity," Rachel said. "I know." Van looked at her directly. "I'm asking about this one too." Rachel considered it for a moment. "Put it in writing," she said. "I'll look at it." She drove back to Denver in the late afternoon, the mountains tracking her on the left side of the highway the whole way, the long light going gold over the peaks the way it had from her apartment window the evening she'd decided to stop waiting. She thought about the patient she'd saved on a morning when the monitors were screaming and the lead surgeon was moving toward the wrong side of a man's chest. She thought about what those 63 seconds had cost her, the suspension, the termination, the letter from legal, the envelope in the freezer, the long kinetic week of calls and drives and federal buildings and parking garages, and what they'd set in motion, and whether the setting in motion had needed her specifically, or whether it had just needed someone willing to step into the sightline of a trauma bay they'd been told to leave. She thought it had needed someone willing. That was the thing. Not someone qualified. There was qualified all over that floor. Someone willing to say the pressure curve is wrong out loud. In a room where saying it was going to cost something, to a person who was not going to thank her for it. That was it. That was the whole mechanism, as far as she could reduce it. The willingness to say the thing in the room where it needed to be said, even when you knew what saying it was going to do to your next 24 hours. She'd spent 7 years building a life around the minimum possible footprint, and she understood why. The reasons were real, and the caution had been warranted, and she didn't have clean hands about every decision she'd made in that period. But she also understood, in the way you understand things that cost you enough to learn properly, that staying small for long enough stopped being tactical and started being something else. It started being the thing they'd tried to make you, the person who'd absorbed the lesson that stepping forward wasn't worth it. She hadn't fully absorbed it, as it turned out. Neither had Rice, driving 18 hours from New Mexico, at a text message. Neither had Decker, building a 2-year case in his living room in Albuquerque. Neither had Margot, feeding surface-level information to a man who thought he had leverage over her while she waited for the moment to step out. They'd all stayed small. They'd all stayed buried in their different ways, for different lengths of time. And none of them had managed to make it permanent, which told her something about the nature of the kind of people who refused unlawful orders in the Rayon Valley. That the capacity for refusal didn't switch off when the immediate stakes went away. It just waited. In September, at the formal ceremony establishing the Oversight Task Force as a permanent unit within the IG's office structure, Rachel stood in a federal building conference room while Colonel Strick read out the unit's charter and mandate and the names of its founding staff. And when he read her name and title, Lead Civilian Medical Consultant, with a secondary designation that referenced the classified unit's formal restoration to the record, she stood straight and said, "Here, the way you answered a roll call, present, accounted for, occupying the space you were supposed to occupy." Holt was there. He'd recovered fully, the drainage line gone, the repair healed, and he moved without guarding his side anymore, which she'd been watching for as a professional habit. He'd testified at the Merriam contractor proceedings and had been formally commended by his oversight committee for the work that had led to the audit request before his accident. He'd said, privately, that being commended for something that had nearly killed him was the kind of thing the Navy did because it was better at paperwork than empathy. She'd said she was familiar with the phenomenon. After the ceremony, he found her near the window. "How's the new unit?" he said. 23 contracts and adding. She looked out at the parking structure. "It's slow work." "Is that okay?" She thought about that honestly. "It's the right kind of slow," she said. "The kind that means you're doing it in a way that holds." He nodded. Then, "I never asked you, when you were standing outside that trauma bay and you saw the pressure curve, did you know what you were going to do before you said anything?" She considered the question. It deserved a considered answer. "I knew what stepping forward was going to cost," she said. "I didn't know everything it was going to set in motion. But you did it anyway. The alternative was watching him die from something I could see and nobody else had caught yet." She looked at Holt. "That wasn't an option I could live with." He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth," he said, "neither could I." She understood what he meant. Neither of them elaborated on it. Outside, Denver was doing its late summer thing, the light holding longer than it had any right to, the mountains going amber in the distance, the city running its ordinary operations below the window with the particular indifference of cities to the specific significance of any given building on any given day. Rachel looked at it. She thought about the nurse everyone at Callaway Regional had called dead weight, and the things that dead weight turned out to be capable of when the situation asked. She thought about what it meant that the people who had tried to bury her and her unit and the truth about what happened in the Rayan Valley had ultimately done so using the same tools: silence, institutional pressure, the leveraging of hierarchy against the people at the bottom of it, that she had spent 7 years learning to work around. They had assumed that the people they buried would stay buried because buried people had, historically, stayed buried when the person doing the burying had enough authority. They had not adequately accounted for the possibility that some people buried themselves deliberately and on purpose as a tactical decision, waiting for the conditions to change. The conditions had changed, and now there were 23 contracts under review and 4 names on a memorial wall that hadn't been there 6 months ago, and a permanent oversight unit with a charter and a mandate and a staff of 7 in a room that smelled like carpet adhesive, and Owen Hale was 2 months into a 22-year sentence, and Merritt was facing a state medical board proceeding, and a records coordinator with a healed wrist had gone back to work at a hospital with a reconstituted board and new administrative leadership, and the knowledge that what he'd done had mattered. Not clean, not seamless, full of the residue and the imperfection and the ongoing nature of work that was never finished, only advanced, but real. She picked up her bag, said goodbye to Holt, nodded to Strick across the room, and took the elevator down to the lobby and walked out into the September afternoon. The work was waiting. She was not afraid of it. She walked toward it.